I didn't think I'd be talking about the power level of weapons again, but I saw an interesting discussion from Hexen, which I'll link in the description. And I just want to say that before this points out, really glad to see more people doing this style of ramble video. I think they're very easy to make, and a lot of people like watching them. And I hope this inspires more people to, give their thoughts and put things out and that kind of thing. Because I think, it's just interesting to hear what more people think about the game. It's generally how, people improve their opinions, and getting that from multiple sources would be a wonderful thing for the game. So please check out Hexen's video. You can do it either before or after this. I don't think it matters too much. And yeah, if you're another player watching this, start talking about the game more. It's cool. It's very helpful. I want to talk about a little bit of a topic that I believe is a large part of the subject for Hexen's video, right? Because I think Hexen was making the argument that there are still a lot of main weapons that feel good and that main weapon power isn't that bad. And I, generally am going to disagree with that. I think main weapon power is in a bad spot right now. But I think there's a larger point that has to be made when talking about some of the stronger weapons in the game, and is the thing that we kind of agree on, which is the skill expression of the best weapons in the game. Right. So I think Blaster is probably the poster child for this problem right now. It's gotten nerfed a little bit, but it still has that factor where you can go, oh, this weapon moves so fast. It's the fastest of every Blaster. It's still got a pretty large AoE. It has very simple specials to use. It's just really, really easy. There's nothing really that hard or complicated about it. Obviously, directs can still be difficult for the weapon. There's still things you have to learn. A weapon being easy doesn't mean it's free. All the disclaimers I usually have to give out. But if you're going to look at this weapon and you're going to compare it to any other blaster in the game, it's going to be really hard to make an argument that all of these are better, right? Luna has to space in a way to where it can jumping two-shot because its squid form is slower than Blaster. That's kind of what this weapon is balanced around. Range Blaster has its slower speed and smaller AoE compared to this weapon. S-Blast has the long-range mode with a very small blast radius. It has to hit very close for its burst combos to work, right? Blaster is probably one of the better main weapons in the game right now. It has, been one of the few weapons that are fighting-based and has gotten buffed instead of nerfed recently. Right, and I think it is relatively on the easier side. And 52 is probably the other one that people are going to point out, where it has, such an overtuned main weapon, because that's what 52 is kind of built as, right? It has so many insane main weapon buffs that you can ignore the fact that it has an incredibly mediocre special that nobody will really care about, and it doesn't even particularly get that many of it. And it doesn't even really matter, because the main plus sub is so crazy. No other wall weapon is anywhere near as ink efficient as this one. None of them can use anywhere near the amount of walls that weapon does. And 52, as like a main weapon, compared to all the other short-range shooters, it just outclasses them so hard. It has more range, it has more paint range, it has, this two-shot. It has good shot velocity since they buffed that. It's crazy, right? And I agree, I would not be opposed to seeing these two weapons nerfed down into the ground, I'm not opposed to seeing that at all. But one question I want to bring up, right? We just had an update that took a look at Blaster, Heavy. I'm not going to count 52 when they nerfed it by 10 points for special. And nerfed those weapons, pretty solidly, right? I think the Blaster nerfs are still pretty noticeable, and Heavy is 100% just a different weapon. It doesn't have the paint it used to have. I think it made the game better that change was done. Do I think the game feels different? Probably not. And my main thought is, if we see this pattern again, if 11.3 comes around in 2 months, and Blaster and 52 get nerfed again, maybe in a more significant way for 52, is the game gonna feel a whole lot better? Maybe, right? I don't know for sure, but I think it won't. And to talk about that, I want to talk about how we've adjusted weapons over the years. I want to look at a few examples here. So I've pulled up a bit of an Inkopedia page, right? Here's a bunch of weapons that I want to look at and talk about. Right. So first off, let's talk about 52. This crazy main weapon that we're all talking about. And one thing I want to look at that I find kind of interesting, right, is 52 throughout the history of S3 has largely been in the same spot, right? Not much has changed. This nerf here was because of solo queue usage, because there was a top JP player using 52 doing very well. A lot of other people picked it up, and it got, a little slap on the wrist, and then it kind of dropped off a little bit, right? 52 throughout the majority of this game's life hasn't been a bad weapon. It's been capable of winning tournaments, but it's never really been a major threat. It has only started to become common after patch 11.0, right? Even this buff didn't necessarily change a lot for the weapon, because it was kind of a buff and a nerf. It didn't change too much for it. It's only when this happened, which wasn't even really a major buff for the weapon, that 52 started seeing use. So 52, while it's a crazy main weapon, and I agree with it being easy and all of that, 52 as a main weapon has not really changed, right? The main weapon, the special, the sub, are all largely the same as they were at the start of the game. There wasn't enough of a significant change for the main weapon on its own to be in a different spot. However, a lot of other weapons that compete with it got changed. Slosher is more ink hungry, and it gets special a lot slower. Range Blaster has a slower blast radius. Squeezer has less range, less shot velocity, and less strafe speed, and its 220, and its special got nerfed, and its ink efficiency got nerfed. Holy shit, we really hate this weapon. S-Blast got a smaller, blast radius for its short range mode, and its burst combos got a bit harder after more recent patches. Splatoon Stamper got, more expensive zipcasters, less pain on its slashes, and therefore even harder to get its specials. Sloshing Machine got a 5-frame nerf and has never recovered since. And there are other weapons that we can talk about. I'm going to get to dualies in a minute here, right? But you get the overall trend when it's come to whatever fighting-based main weapon has been strong over the past few years, they have tended to get less strong. And usually the nerfs aren't something I have a problem with. I think that a lot of the nerfs for these weapons have been good for them. And in fact, I'm going to save my discussion for this in a second, right? But I don't think there has been much of an effort to compensate when meta shifts push them even lower, right? I think range is probably the best example for this, right? Because this nerf needed to happen, the blast radius one up here. I still think, and I know there'll be people who disagree, I still think Range Blaster in its current spot deserves this blast radius, or I guess it's this one now, whatever, largely the same thing. I think it deserved that smaller blast radius. The AoE of the weapon was incredibly annoying to deal with. It was too good, it was irritating to fight, and made the game less fun. It reduced the skill required for a weapon that is supposed to be one of the harder ones for the class. It should be changed. However, the meta has then continued to shift and develop and change. There are now other blasters that are really good. There are now faster mobility weapons in the game. The type of weapons that it is fighting is changing. And because of that, Range Blaster has gotten a lot worse. It hasn't done anything relevant since. Has Range Blaster gotten anything because of that? No, not at all. This doesn't even really count. These changes are small, and then they got half reverted later, right? Range Blaster hasn't gotten anything to help it out. We can look at Squeezer, and it's the same thing. After these nerfs, Zuka got nerfed even further. Squeezer hasn't done anything since 9.0. Has Squeezer gotten anything to help it out? No, it's largely gotten ignored. And I mean, Slosher Machine is like the perfect one. It got over-nerfed like crazy. It did not need that. What have we done for it? Well, in like 3 years, we gave it 10 points for special on a Booyah Bomb. That's it. These are the global changes. We haven't done anything for Machine, right? We have this habit, and Stamper's another example, I could keep going on about other weapons like this, of nerfing down main weapons. Then maybe indirect changes hurt them more, and we don't do anything to compensate. Once a weapon gets nerfed down to the point where it's not a problem, it feels like the devs kind of ignore it, Like, okay, we've done our job with this weapon, it's done. We don't have to worry about it anymore. And I just am not a fan of that approach to balancing, especially when a lot of these weapons I think are kind of interesting for the game. I think Machine or Stamper or like any of them could be kind of interesting. And not all of these weapons are necessarily bad right now. We have weapons like S-Blast and Slosher that still retain a lot of their power. But again, when they're competing with weapons like 52 that are easier, the point that I'll agree with Hexon on, right? It's not as worth it to use. Why play S-Blast when you can play Blaster as like the prime example? There is another example of nerfs that I want to talk about, though, that aren't as main weapon focused, but I believe affect how main weapons feel to play. So let's take a look at Dually. I personally like a lot of the changes that Dually got going into Splatoon 3, or rather what it got in early S3. I like that it got a more lenient hitbox in some cases. I think the weapon was very hard to track people. I especially like that it got faster. I think that Dually is more fighting focused than other shooters, so having its rolls be something that it can sufficiently use to move around and avoid other players is really important for the weapon's balance and how it's going to feel as a whole. But after 9.3, or I guess like around 10.0 or so, we started to see some changes to Crab. Crab got less damage, and then it got a smaller blast radius. On paper, I don't have a problem with these changes, right? I think they're good changes. I think Crab having less AoE is going to make it more engaging to fight. I don't think it needed 90 damage. I think it being a little easier to heal after a direct is fine. If I look at the special versus player interactions, I don't really have a big issue with these kind of nerfs. But what I do have a problem with is how these kind of nerfs affect the weapons attached to them. A weapon like Splash at least got 3% better range. It got to be a better main weapon at fighting to compensate for Crab. Dooley not only got nothing, it got less of those crabs that are already getting worse. Dooley is now a lot more dependent on the main weapon. That's what these changes do. When the special gets weaker, when the special output gets weaker, the weapon is going to have more times where it's reliant on the main weapon to get value. And I don't think Dooley is a bad main weapon or anything. But if it's going to be more main weapon focused, then I think the main weapon needs to be increased in its power. I think Dooley should be better at doing whatever Dooley things it's doing if it's going to get less special and that special is going to be less effective. I think that's important in balancing the weapon. And like Squeezer is the other example of this, where Squeezer is 220p for a lottery special that will oftentimes do nothing, and the main weapon already barely paints. It being 220 made sense when Zuka wasn't a lottery, when its outside hitbox was horrifyingly large and would kill you. It doesn't make sense at all with Zuka in the way it is currently balanced, in a way where it's actually difficult and a lot of times you are going to get nothing. And I think that trend can't really be ignored, that this is also a factor. Like, even if some of these midlines or main weapons are in a decent spot, that the power level is just lower on pretty much any main weapon or fighting option that you are going to be able to look at, right? That a lot of these high skill investment weapons are just not as worth it. And you can even look at other weapons that got nerfed back in S2, right? Brella is not bad right now. Brella's in a spot where it can still do things. Do you think it's in a spot to where people are going to pick up Brella? Probably not. And I wonder if a weapon like Dooley is in largely the same spot. A weapon like Squeezer, a weapon like Stamper. A lot of these weapons are in a case of, like, why on earth would I play them when I could play something like 52 or Blaster? And yes, maybe the problem would be solved by just nerfing, 52 and Blaster. But I don't know. Is an environment where every weapon feels more worth it to play because across the board all the main weapons just feel worse now the right way to go about it? I don't know. I think even if 52 and Blaster get nerfed, if they're not over-nerfed, they're largely still going to maintain the same dynamic they have now if other main weapons aren't changed. The other note that I want to point out, right, and another problem that I think I've noticed more recently is special weapons. I think that special weapons are largely suffering from a similar dynamic. I think the specials that are harder to use are not as worth it. Zuka is hard to get a kill with these days. Zipcaster carries a lot of risk of you dying. So does Inkjet, especially with all the backlines right now. The weapon most popular because they've largely not been hit by a lot of nerfs like supports and aggro weapons have. Weapons like Stamp are, more difficult now that we nerfed the throw mode, but probably a little bit more lenient. Crab's been made worse. So we don't see as much of these as we do weapons like Strike that are pretty simple to use, Cooler that you just throw out, Chumps that the bow is just going to throw out, Whale that the 52 is going to shoot, a Bubble or Splashdown that the Blaster is going to deploy. Largely, the comp is going to be composed of specials that are very easy and basic to use, and it means that there's going to be a lot less dynamic actions in a game. And I think that's especially important when balancing weapons like this, right? Or even weapons like Heavy. Heavy Splatling would have a lot harder of a time if there were a lot of specials that could close the gap or find a way to kill it more quickly. In fact, before Heavy got nerfed, Inkjet was seeing a slight spike in popularity precisely because it could do that, even if it would be largely offset by the Charger paired with the Heavy Splatling it was with. But imagine how much easier backlines would be to deal with if Zipcaster was good, or Zuka was good, or Inkjet was better, whatever you want to call it. The only real option you have right now is something like Inkvac, which is a more coordinated option rather than an individual power spike. And these specials also help when dealing with other closer range weapons. A 52 in close range is very hard to deal with. A Blaster in close range is very hard to deal with. Hammer against a Blaster is very easy for the Hammer user. It's actually sided towards that player. I mean, it better be given it's a special. And so if there were a prominent Hammer weapon that saw a lot of use, that might be one way of challenging Blaster. Not that Blaster would be okay if there was a Hammer weapon that got picked every game. But it would be, one small dent in that main weapon's armor to make it a little bit easier to deal with. And right now, the way specials are balanced, these kind of more interesting weapons that require a lot more investment and could potentially, alter a lot of main weapon dynamics for which weapons are in powerful positions are largely not strong enough to be worth using with very few exceptions, and it's kind of just the exact same problem on the specials end of things. I think that the meta we have right now is a result of where skill expression right now is. That we had a lot of harder weapons that were the better weapons to play, and whether it's because of the specials or the mains or both, those have been toned back over time. And that's why, to me, there is a main weapon power level decrease. Even if you can turn and point to other crazy weapons, a large part of them are already in the spot that they were at before or are largely not that different than before. Like, I don't think Blaster right now is that much stronger than Blaster used to be. It's 1 frame faster with a slightly smaller blast radius, less than a unit, right? I think that the larger factor to Blaster being as good as it is right now is the fact that other weapons are weaker, not necessarily Blaster's buff. I hold that same opinion for 52. If you're someone who finds Dynamo a problem, and I don't, it won its first Area Cup recently, I think that the main weapon is balanced just fine with its tradebacks, right? But if you are someone who thinks Dynamo is a problem, right? The influx of mid-range weapons that can shut it down that we used to have would be really nice at making this weapon a lot less of a problem. Because what are we going to do about a weapon like Dynamo right now? All right, we could nerf it down to be where it used to be, where it felt miserable, and we'd just be back where we started, right? I'm still fine if they want to nerf it in some way to make it harder. You could make the horizontal flick have a little bit less kill range, but still more than it used to be a long time ago. Yeah, I'm fine with something like that. But I don't think it's going to really change the overall problems people have with the weapon if there's not other better weapons to contest it. I think Splatoon 3 and Splatoon in general is full of a lot of weapons that can feel very stupid in their own ways, and that's just kind of how the game is. We have a game where everyone is really fast and has 100 HP and has a built-in teleport. It is naturally going to be very extreme, and weapons that are good in this game are going to have attributes to exploit those systems in one way or another. And I think that's kind of what makes the game interesting, both from a main weapon and a special weapon perspective. So, I guess to conclude, I think it's fair to say that there are lower skill expression weapons that still feel like crazy main weapons, but I still hold that as a whole, power level is going down. And as a whole, there still need to be a lot of buffs to a lot of the harder weapons for this game to feel better, and that just nerfing something like 52 or Blaster isn't going to solve it. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't have a lot of high hopes for the game's balance history going forward. I'm definitely the more pessimistic view of it because I think we are nearing the end of this game and I don't see a lot of changes to fix these kind of problems. But, that's just my view. Hopefully this gives a bit of an insight as to how I feel about it and, hopefully things change. I think at the end of the day, a lot of competitive players hold the view that, a lot of the better weapons are too easy and a lot of the harder weapons should be a little bit more worth it to use than they are right now. So we'll have to see what happens. All right, thanks for watching.